Right. I have to ask, what's with the dummy then?
Which one? There's loads of dummies in here. This is like my gym. Uh, when you sit in front of a computer all day, you need to relax. You need to do the exact opposite of sitting in front of a computer. So I like to get as physical as possible. It's actually mainly a weightlifting room. Don't be confused by the punch bags or anything. It's mainly I come in here to lift weights.
Oh, right. Is that so? That's a big part of it then, of your life, of your day-to-day life.
Not only part of my life. I as pretentious as it sounds, I find it links back into my work because I'll come in here and I'll look down at something that weighs more than me, and I'll lift it over my head. And then I'll go back to my office and I'll sit in front of a workload that weighs more than me, and
Mm.
I'll lift that over my head. So it's the same pathology for me, where it's setting goals and working towards them and accomplishing them. And that's what exercise has really taught me over the past 20 years is
Mm. And
it redefines what you can and can't do. And
mm.
I've taken that with me into the professional world as well as into my personal world.
And because obviously the professional world, I think that a lot of people haven't checked in with you lately on the professional world. Obviously, on your website, there was a time at which you were a teacher. I understand. I
Yeah.
mean, I imagine that's now no longer the case.
Oh no, since 2012, I reinvented myself as a mobile developer. But
Mm.
yeah, there was a while there in 2009 where I sidestepped into the education sector. Um, and I started. I don't know how long it's been since you've been in a school, but they're very high tech these days with very big whiteboards, interactive whiteboards. And it wasn't a million miles removed from what I was doing with games. So I would go into schools and I would encourage them to use this technology uh, to just to enhance the learning. I had ambitions of making learning fun and all things like that, but halfway through that process, I kind of stopped believing in my own message because I came to the conclusion that entertainment doesn't really have much of a role to play in education, and that academic rigor is where it's at. And I didn't want to contribute any longer to education being a circus.
Mm.
But it wasn't without its merits, and I did make some apps that have been used in over 10,000 classrooms all over the world. Um, and in 2011, the TES Awards
Mm.
invited me to that. And so, yeah, it's not. I suppose that was my attempt to have a normal job, and it kind of made me appreciate being self-employed because I thought the grass was greener on the other side. Part of me wanted to work 9 to 5, to clock in, to clock out, and not take my work home with me. But then it turns out I don't like to be at a certain place at a certain time on somebody else's clock, making somebody else rich, and having to seek somebody else's approval. It made me appreciate being self-employed. And since I've been back to it, there's not a day goes by I don't appreciate being my own boss now.
Well, because I mean, this is the thing. I guess you more than anybody else, Matt, from your pedigree in creating these games off your own back, a one-man band doing this is demonstrable of your commitment and your ability to focus on that. I mean, how? Maybe we should start at the beginning. How did you come into games development? Because you must have been incredibly young then. Because I mean, still young now.
Well, I like to think I've always been making games because before I even had a computer, I would make my own card games and dice games, and I even made my own crazy golf course in the back garden. So when I got a computer, that just became the ultimate outlet for the same desire to create my own entertainment. And by that time, I was about 18, and I had been introduced to real programming at college. And from there, I enrolled in one of the first courses in the UK to teach game development as a subject, as a degree.
Hmm.
And I'm reluctant to credit that with anything that happened next because it was a question of I didn't teach anything that I didn't teach myself.
Hmm.
It was a case of the blind leading the blind in the early days of that course. But halfway through that process, I was already making games for an audience, working in my own time. Um, And by the time I graduated, I hit the ground running, and I carried on doing it on my own terms for the next 10 years with some highs, some lows. Um, but yeah.
Yeah. What made you want to develop games in the first place? I mean, obviously you had that passion from being a kid, but there's a difference in, drawing up games on pen and paper and doing it as part of a college degree or course or something like that, and then actually going ahead and doing it. What was kind of the catalyst for the very first MDicky game?
Um, the, it's hard to bookmark these things because it really is such a natural progression. Because we could talk about the first game I ever made, the first game I ever made public, the first game I ever sold. These three different branches of firsts, and so the first game I ever made, and even then we're talking about the first text game I made, the first 2D game I made, the first 3D game I made. I find it very hard to discuss my origins without going back to my childhood and saying this was always my passion to create entertainment. And all I can say is that I was fortunate enough that my hobby turned into a profession, because that's all I did really. For the first 3 years of making games, I had no intention of doing it professionally. It was something I was so passionate about that I just did it every day, with or without recognition, with or without approval, with or without money. And then in about 2002, I sold my first game and did it professionally. So it all comes back to, I think as a gamer as well, I knew what I wanted to play, and it didn't always exist. And so it's a question, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And so I was always hugely motivated to create something that didn't exist, that I wanted to play. And I'm just fortunate that eventually people all over the world shared my enthusiasm for certain concepts and came along with me. But it's always me trying to entertain my younger self.
That's interesting. I mean, are you ever surprised at the popularity of your games? The half-life that they have, because you've been doing this for so long now, and they get mainstream recognition.
Yes, I'm certainly surprised that the games I made 10 years ago are still floating around on YouTube, and I never envisaged that. And part of me resents it because that's me learning. That's my learning process. And people put it on YouTube and they pull it out of context and pretend I made that last week, and they criticize it as though it's the best thing I've ever made. And part of me wishes my past happened behind closed doors, and that's what I like about my reinvention as a mobile developer. To millions of people, that doesn't exist. All these PC games you're talking about, they don't exist. And they know me as this guy who made Wrestling Revolution onwards. They think my career started in 2012, and part of me is quite happy about that. It's a rebirth and a reinvention, and it's a new page. But certainly, it is a compliment that people are still playing games I made 15 years ago, no matter whether it's sincerely or insincerely, it's still in their psyche. And part of me, that's a kind of success. I don't think you can be around for 17 years and dismiss somebody as a failure the way some people do. I think if you've been around that long and completed that many projects, I think there's something to celebrate there. And I'm personally proud of how many games I've made and how many different genres I've tackled. Because there will be some failures and amongst the successes, because that's how you learn. That's how you develop. So I'm proud of the rich, varied history I've had, even if it makes me easy to criticize in the eyes of other people.
And it's interesting because, for example, part of the reason why I've been playing your games, from the early 2000s, because I grew up in that time and I liked wrestling as a kid.
Oh, right.
Okay. And so, but part of the reason why I revisited this now and suggested it to my editor was that I was watching a video on Giant Bomb where they played one of your games, and it gets to the heart of that, where I guess it can be difficult because you're putting your life's work and all your effort into this in your spare time and producing these incredibly complex games, and yet people sometimes see it as a thing to poke fun at. I mean, you, how do you tally their viewpoints with all the effort that you put in?
Of course, it's disappointing when people take that attitude. I would add that there's no downside as far as I'm concerned, because every time somebody criticizes my games that publicly, that persistently, I get 1,000 new paying customers. So it is true that there's no such thing as bad publicity to a certain extent. The house always wins, in my opinion, and that house is creativity. Creativity always wins. The creative person always wins. That is to say, they always have the satisfaction of having put forth their best effort. They have the satisfaction of reaching some people that do enjoy what they've created. And the criticism I find frustrating more than hurtful, because I think there's an intelligent conversation to be had about the pros and cons of how I make games. But nobody wants to have that. Except us, of course. I'm quite happy that you do seem to be taking that tack. Nobody wants to have the intelligent conversation about what's happening here. They just want to say, this is shit, he's a cunt. And for me, that doesn't get to the heart of the matter. That's playground insults, and I think we can do better.
And it's interesting, though, because, as you say, having that conversation about how games have changed. I mean, even in the time that you've been developing games, in the early 2000s, around the times of the Hardy Stunt Challenge, which I guess
wow.
was
You really know your stuff. That's true. That's the first game I released publicly. Yeah.
I mean, so in terms of producing that specific game, because I guess you talked about three different sort of starting points. I mean, let's take that one as a starting point. What was the process behind that? How long did it take you to produce it? And what was involved in it, and how did it feel when you eventually got it out there publicly for the first time?
Well, I was walking through Woolworths one day, which is a now extinct department store, and I found this package called Div Game Studio that promised to make game development easy. As easy as it could possibly be. And I picked up that software and I took it home, and I spent that summer, the summer of 2000, exactly 17 years ago. I took that home and I taught myself how to use it from the examples. And as you said, I made that simple wrestling game that only took about 2 weeks to make, because it was so simple. It was just wrestlers jumping off from a height, performing stunts and getting points. I've always said to people that you do have to start that small, because I'm not capable of making an entire wrestling game. So what I had to do was focus on a particular tiny slice of a wrestling game and make a game out of it. And that's how you have to get your beginnings. But some people don't want to hear that. They want to dive in at the deep end and make an entire wrestling game. And it never happens, because it is a step-by-step process. But getting back to your question, it took 2 weeks to make that. I was satisfied with the result on my end, and I contacted a wrestling site, which is no longer around. I contacted this wrestling site and said, I've made a game about wrestling. It's quite topical. Why don't you throw it up on your website and just let people download it? And they did that, and that's what they did, and it reached about 15,000 people.
Wow.
And the feedback was really positive. I was, getting fan mail saying, "Can we have more of this? This is really fun." And yeah, it was a joyful moment to be not only making a game that I enjoyed, but to have a few thousand other people share my enthusiasm for it. That really gave me the impetus to make more. And by the time I made the next game, I had my own website. By November 2000, the reaction to it was such that I started my own website to host my own games instead of just throwing them up on this website. But without their help, it probably never would have happened. So it is important to reach out to people and to just to create your own opportunities. Nobody said, "Hey, do you want to come and make a wrestling game and put it on our website?" I had to make the wrestling game. I had to go to the website. I had to think a couple of steps ahead. And then I started my own website. You'll often see people start their own website and then beg people to come to the website. it didn't quite work that way back in 2000. I don't know. Things have changed.
Hmm.
You have to remember
But
that
that's
you have to remember
impressive.
that 2000 was the early days of the internet still, and everything you found on there was new and exciting. Whether it was just a screenshot of a game or a sound file, there weren't too many videos or anything like that before until YouTube came along, and those were simpler times, more innocent times, and it was easier to stand out, I feel. Every little thing I uploaded in the year 2000 got a very positive reaction. Oh, this is cute. I'll download it at the on the college computers and show my friends. And it was a different time to be part of this internet culture.
And those 2 weeks that you were creating that first game, then, Matt, I mean, was it because you must have been in school or college at the time, were you?
In 2000, I was at college. Yes, so
Yeah.
I was at college. That's the British definition of college. I don't want to confuse
Yeah.
any American. Is this going to a British or an American audience? Both.
I'll be writing it in a British sense, but it'll be
Yeah,
going on an
it's,
American
we're
website.
so global now. I have to speak in about 3
I
different
know.
languages, internally, 3 different cultures. But um, yes, I was at college. I was an 18-year-old, 17-year-old turning 18. I was studying computing at that college where they introduced me to some basic programming, but not for the purpose of games.
Yeah.
That's quite an interesting story in its own right because when we discovered we were going to learn programming, everyone was excited. And then we realized how hard it was, and everybody's heart sank, except mine, because he taught us how to make this simple text game, and everybody's heart sank. But I was cool with it, and this was enough for me. And I went home and I made a wrestling simulator in text, and that was fine for me. That was progress, and I was genuinely excited about it. And they dismissed me as deluded. Oh, you're deluded to get excited about that. That's nothing. But because I enjoyed it, I did it, and because I did it, I got better. And those text games turned into 2D games, and the 2D games turned into 3D games, and the 3D games turned into mobile apps. So when you look back at that process, it's important not to belittle your opportunities, and it's important to enjoy them and to see them for what they are, for what they could possibly be.
And so those 2 weeks when you were creating Hardy Stunt, I mean, was that if you're at college all day, then it must be evenings and weekends that you're doing that.
Evenings and weekends, yeah. To be honest, I had just moved to a new town, and I had been pulled. Been pulled away from my friends and family where I grew up. So it was quite a solitary existence for those couple of years at college, which kind of worked out okay for me professionally because I had nothing much to do except develop my own hobbies. So even though it was emotionally difficult and personally difficult, I think it was the making of me professionally because it directed me towards computing and game development, and it gave me those extra hours to dedicate myself to it.
And you touched on it there. You said 15,000 people downloaded it. I guess it's sort of like a prototypical viral hit. I mean, and you did mention that you think maybe it's harder nowadays to stand out. I mean, do you think you would have had the success that you have had were you coming along as a 17-year-old creating a game now?
It's a different kind of success. I do feel I reinvented myself in a way because in 2012 I kind of do see it as starting again because it was kind of from scratch and it was a new audience. I calculated that I only took about 2,000 of my old fans with me on this journey to mobile apps being played by millions of people. And so, to answer your question, I think I could have started again in 2012 and had this success on mobiles. But yes, it's certainly true that there are eras of game development where some things are easier and some things are more difficult, especially before and after broadband internet and things like that.
It's interesting then only 2,000 original fans out of how many do you think?
Well, you have to bear in mind that I disappeared in 2009, as we discussed, to do some educational work. And by 2008, my games were already in decline. They were failing to impress the PC master race, who had very high standards of what they expect from a video game, and it was no longer something that I could provide. And I was fortunate that what was considered behind the times and below average on PC was ahead of its time on a mobile if you just transplant the same work. So I managed to find new audiences with old work, and I know for a fact that only 2,000 people were on my Facebook page when I started making that game.
Wow.
So
That's incredible. The different sort of eras, as you say.
yeah, I mean, when you've been doing this so long, it really is different eras, different decades. Yeah.
And I mean, sort of having to rebuild from scratch must have been very difficult.
Yes and no. It wasn't difficult because I had a lot of breathing space. Nobody expected anything from me. Expectations were very low, and I reveled in the freedom, knowing that nobody knew what I was up to. There was this really exciting 6 months in 2012 where my fans knew that I was working on something, but they didn't know what. They didn't know if it was wrestling. They didn't know if it was 2D. They didn't know if it was 3D. And then 6 months into 2012, I released a screenshot of a mobile app, a very fuzzy screenshot of a mobile app with 2D wrestling characters. And yeah, that generated a buzz among the 2,000 faithful that were following a developer who had pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth for 3 years. They were still checking for me and they were trying to will me back into PC game development. That was their ultimate hope and their ultimate goal. And there were a lot of people that said, I remember someone dismissed it as a crazy dream to make mobile apps. And so 10 million downloads later, here we are.
And was there ever a point at which you thought maybe I won't come back at all?
Yeah, that was pretty much the plan in 2009, was to kind of disappear. Because I felt I had taken it. What I kept saying to myself was, I've given people my best and it's not good enough. I felt I had reached. I was making the best games I possibly could under the circumstances, under my solitary circumstances. And it's either good enough or it isn't. Oh, it isn't. Well, okay, I've enjoyed this ride. I'm going to have to find something else to do. If not as a hobby, then I'm going to have to do something else professionally to make a living. And yeah, I was done. As I said, I didn't enjoy being self-employed. I didn't enjoy living and dying by my creativity. I thought the grass was greener on the other side. I thought there was a more stable existence for me. And yeah, because you have to bear in mind, I was working all day, every day, and the rewards weren't always there. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. I would have good years and bad years. And so I calculated that I was often earning less than the minimum wage. I was often earning less than the minimum wage as a self-employed individual, because I was working 12 hours a day, and sometimes I wouldn't earn enough. So it definitely wasn't appealing financially, it wasn't appealing creatively, and it wasn't appealing personally, and I disappeared until something motivated me to reinvent myself and give it one more try in a completely different way.
What I better make this my last question, Matt, for now. But because I know
you're okay. We've got until 7:30. It's up to you if you're in a.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, what then? You said something motivated you to come back. What was it?
Well, 2012 was a huge turning point in my life, because at the beginning of it, I was unemployed. I was about to buy my first house, and my first child was on the way. And by the end of it, I had reinvented myself as a mobile developer, and everything was set. So there's this real transformation from the beginning of 2012 to the end of 2012. So I suppose the motivating factor was I had a lot of real life responsibilities, such as a child and a house and a wife to support. And although that would drive most people to a normal job, and it almost did, my wife did tell me to consider getting a normal job. What it did was it motivated me to work so hard on one last project, on one last attempt to make something of game development, that I scratched and clawed and did everything to make it happen. And it wasn't always easy because I had to learn how to make games for Android and then how to get a game onto the Apple Store. And those were both incredibly difficult tasks, even after you've created a game. The publishing side of it was enormously difficult. And just the motivating factor that I had to do this, or I would never do it again. It made me work every waking hour. And then, rather poetically, almost the same month that my child was born, my career as a mobile developer was born. When I finished the project at the same time she was born. And they both kind of blossomed together, and it turned out to be successful. It did 50,000 downloads in its first month. And I was able to live off the advertising alone from those numbers. And it eventually went on to do 1 million downloads, and it eventually went on to do 10 million downloads. And I find it very poetic that she was the motivating factor for me to work hard. And she has also been the recipient of its success.
Does she have any idea about what you do?
No, she knows I work a lot. She knows I work a lot with computers and iPads and things like that. What I'm more interested in is her. Because as I said, I used to make games as a child, and so that makes me very conscious of what her childhood is and what kind of formative process that's going to be. And I see her making games. I see her inventing games and making rules and making, these are the rules, this is the challenge that stops it, this is what makes it mean something. I see her going through those thought processes, and I suppose a normal parent might be quite dismissive of that and think it doesn't mean anything. But I see it for what it is, and I'm quite supportive of it. So yeah, I get to enjoy it all over again in my own children. The creative spirit, this creative desire.
So, yeah, the big comeback in 2012. You're uploading this to the Play Store and to the App Store.
Google Play mainly, yeah, and the Apple Store, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess at some point you're pushing that button to upload it and to submit it for verification. I mean, put me in your shoes at that point. What are you feeling? How's that?
I still remember the day I got that. As I said, I worked so hard to get the approval from Apple, and just to compile a program that Apple will upload, and you have to buy a Mac. You have to buy a Mac to do the uploading because they're so closed and they like things in a certain way. There's so many hoops to jump through. And so when I did finally see that green tick that says, "Ding, you've uploaded an app successfully," it meant so much to me. It's such a relief, because there were times when I thought, this is so difficult, it's never going to happen. I've tried everything and this doesn't work, and now I've got to go and buy a Mac, and then that still doesn't work because I've got to learn how to do this. And there were times when I thought, I can't do this. It's not going to work. It's not going to go as I planned. But you do, as I said, it's scratching and clawing and persistence, and you keep trying until you learn what you're supposed to learn. You do what you're supposed to do, and what happens is supposed to happen.
So that first publicly released game took 2 weeks to code. I imagine that the big 2012 comeback took a bit longer than that.
That was a huge 6-month process, yeah, at least. And then it carried on for another 6 months, fine-tuning it and adding career modes and RPG elements. So I'd say it took a year to develop the wrestling games from beginning to end.
But they've proved, from that one, and this is what you talk about, I think, on your Twitter before, you said that people ask you often kind of why all the games interrelate and share similar aspects. I mean, that's simply economies of scale. For someone like yourself, I guess you don't have enough time to be able to completely build a new thing from scratch.
Certainly nowadays. In the old days, I did used to start from scratch more often than people realize. That was my assumption, is that, okay, I'm supposed to start from scratch again now, and I'll reuse a few things. But nowadays, I do recycle a lot of elements. Some people accuse me of reskinning the games, which doesn't do justice to how much programming is going on underneath them. Anyone who believes that is welcome to reprogram hard time into a school, because that took me about at least 3 months of solid programming. But I have started to see it as an asset with shared universes and consistent game elements. It's hard to argue against it, really. I mean, it's like reinventing the wheel. I would have to have a very, very good reason to deviate from this 2D puppetry that has A, been very successful, and B, is fit for purpose. And the day that I do deviate from it is the day that all previous games will stop sharing features. So, well, maybe that day will come. I'm experimenting with Unity. The day that I switch game engines is the day that we will see a new evolutionary jump forward for my games.
But I guess that, things like the fact that there are game engines like Unity have been a boon for you.
Yes.
Presumably.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't be here without those game engines, and that's what I said I saw in Woolworths. I saw Div Game Studio. It was this little, I think it was Basic. It was a version of Basic that introduced me to programming. It was easy enough to learn, but difficult enough to mean something. You have got to strike that balance where if something's too easy, all of the games are the same. There's no personal input. It has to be difficult enough that it's you, and it's you working hard to create something unique.
It's interesting. I'm looking at the Div website, and they're still
Is it still going?
uploading. Yeah, they're still uploading builds, which seems crazy to me. In terms of your games, then, Matt, I mean, I think that people can spot an MDicky game from a mile off it. It's very distinctive. I mean, what kind of do you think, as the creator of all of these games, sort of typifies one of your products?
I suppose coming back to that consistency thing, they're all going to be the same anyway if they're all made by one person. You can't expect there to be too much variety from one mind. It's like expecting Family Guy to be different from American Dad, or for Futurama to be different from The Simpsons. It's the same creative vision with a slight twist on it. And one thing I will say about my games is that they are often deliberately cartoonish. They are deliberately sub-realistic, because I know I cannot depict realism. So I happily depict these bright colors and this they're somewhat deformed. They're deliberately deformed. They've got slightly larger heads, because that's me kind of paying tribute to the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64 for 3D. Those were the games I enjoyed growing up, and that's the artistic style I aspired to, which is low poly, low resolution, but the fun comes first and the gameplay is on point. Part of me still thinks he's developing games of that nature, and that's what I like about mobile development, is that I have found my niche. I found an audience that likes this brand of gaming, and I'm one of them. I like old-fashioned games. I like old-fashioned visuals. I don't like realism in computer games.
And so you touched on it a bit there, Matt, but what is it, do you think, that makes your games so popular? I mean, over 20 or more years now, well, 20 years, sorry, it's been, it's had a committed fan base, albeit with that slight dip in, the late 2000s. But But what is it that makes your games quite so popular?
I think it's because there's always. I wouldn't have made each game if there wasn't something unique about them. If I didn't have something to offer, I wouldn't be enthusiastic about making it, and they wouldn't be enthusiastic about playing it. So every project begins with a unique selling point. And even the wrestling games that have been done a thousand times before, I will find a unique twist on it, such as the backstage elements, the backstage realism. If you want a game like that in the palm of your hand on a mobile, you're not going to get very far. Therefore, my game is the first thing that people come across, and that's where the millions of downloads come from. I've made something unique enough that people have to give it a chance. They might not like it, but they have to. They've got nowhere else to go for that experience. And arguably, the same is true of the prison simulator, Hard Time, and the school simulator, School Days. It's the number one search result for school. It's often the number one search result for prison. I find a genre that's been neglected, and I either do it first, do it differently, or do it best. I aspire to do one of those three things.
That's amazing. And doing one of those three things in each game, you've managed to make a living out of this. I mean, I know that you have your mobile development, day-to-day business as well, but I mean, this has given you what, fame and fortune.
Yes, I can't. Yeah. Well, yeah. I am unfortunate that I never have to work again for the rest of my life, and that I do this for the love of it. Yes.
What keeps you going then? If you don't have to work, if you're lucky enough to not be able to work the rest of your life, why keep doing it?
As I said, it's what I enjoy doing creatively. I think everybody needs that balance where they enjoy what they do and they get that fulfillment from it. And I've actually heard, I think it's dopamine. I think programming emits dopamine in the brain, and it's a very addictive feeling to encounter a problem and to solve it. As I said, it comes back to the gym. It's me standing in front of a problem and solving it step by step. And that's what I do in my office as well. I put myself in front of challenges and I see how far I can take them. And as I said, I make the games I would want to play. So if something doesn't exist, I'm still motivated to bring it into existence for my own amusement. I'm not ashamed to say that I often play my own games to pass the time because they're aimed at me. They appeal to me. I want to have a wrestling career. I want to manage a wrestling promotion. So I fire up my own game and I give it a go as much as anybody else.
Have you ever thought of starting your own wrestling promotion? I mean, if if you're lucky enough to not have to work again, presumably you could go into a sideline, you could create a hobby out of wrestling.
Yeah, part of me, when I was younger, part of me assumed that the virtual world and the real world of wrestling would intertwine for me. I often came close to working with real promotions and real wrestlers, but it always backfired. It was always a financial issue where they thought it was some sort of ticket to fame and fortune for them, and that oh right, we're going to sell 1 million copies of a game, and this is going to be $1 million cash injection for us. And I was like, this is just a bit of fun for me. I'm not going to promise you, a huge financial return, and quite frankly, you don't deserve one if I'm the one doing all the work. So it often fell apart financially. So yeah, it was this awkward stalemate where I have nothing to offer the real world of wrestling, and they have nothing to offer me because they would like to make out that our wrestlers are going to legitimize your game, and if you use our wrestlers, it's going to make the game more popular. But the opposite was true. I could take an independent brand and make them famous overnight. I don't say that conceitedly. It's just mathematical certainty that I could take a brand and expose them to 10 million wrestling fans tomorrow, and that is an asset for me, and not for anybody else at this stage.
Mm. Do you must take that responsibility very seriously, that massive fan base.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting because in wrestling, historians talk about how the WWF bought WCW, and and instead of becoming twice as popular, it stayed the same, and
Mm.
they alleged that those fans disappeared. But I suspect that those fans are still playing wrestling games. I think they turned to the virtual world to enjoy their wrestling on their own terms when WWF's monopoly wasn't to their liking. I, I suspect that there are more wrestling fans in the world than watch WWE, and I think my numbers prove it. Wrestling Revolution 3D is on course to surpass 50 million downloads by the end of the year, and Google will go public with that information by the end of the year. And that's 50 million wrestling fans, and there aren't quite that many fans of WWE's products. So I think it's a question of wrestling fans finding, as I said, finding solace in wrestling games. It's also true of Fire Pro Wrestling. That's become extraordinarily popular on Steam, and that's a non-branded wrestling game that's diametrically opposed to what people are being spoon-fed from WWE. I think as WWE descends in the ratings, which it is doing in TV ratings, I can see a direct correlation with wrestling games becoming more popular. I do believe there's some sort of connection.
Mm. I mean, those numbers are astounding, Matt. I mean, do you ever get recognised on the street? I mean,
No.
when you've got that many millions of fans, they must at some point. Someone must go. You're the guy that makes that game that I play all the time.
Well, I have no public identity. Hardly anybody knows what I look like. So it's not as if it's 50 million people who have downloaded my face onto a mobile phone. They've downloaded something I made, and my name briefly flashes up at the beginning of it. And as you can see from my Twitter thing, only 30,000 people have sought me out as a human being. And I'm fine with that. I think I've struck a nice balance where I've got all the benefits of fame and fortune and none of the downsides. But I think it's actually the other way around. I, in public, see other people playing my games, and that gives me an enormous amount of satisfaction. And recently on a train out of London, I came back and somebody had stolen my seat on the train. And he pulls out his mobile phone and he starts playing Wrestling Revolution 3D. And part of me enjoyed the irony of this guy stealing my seat on a train, and he didn't know he stole it from the guy who made the game he's playing. And I didn't know whether to throw him off the train or give him a pat on the back.
Did you tell him that was your game?
No, it was only a young boy. I didn't really want to confuse him, but and I didn't want to make it all about me. But there's been about 10 instances like that where I've seen people out in public playing my games, and different games as well. That's one of the things I'm most proud of, is that people will come to my games for different reasons from different places. So I've seen girls playing School Days on the tube in London. I've seen people play the Prison Sim Hard Time in a bar, and it is enormously satisfying to see people enjoying your work in public whilst you are private. It's this huge contradiction. But if you think about it, there aren't many fields of entertainment where you can actually see other people enjoying your work, like I suppose, apart from seeing someone reading a book you wrote or something. It's quite rare, and that's what I love about mobiles, is that if we were still chained to our desks on the PC, I wouldn't be seeing any of this, and there wouldn't be these interactions. But because you're literally taking it with you wherever you go, it's ubiquitous, and I love everything about mobile development. It's been very good for me. Yeah.
Do you ever get to take, do you take a moment when you see these people in real life and sort of just step back and look and see how they're reacting to the games, or is it just very fleeting? You don't want to
It's
linger.
fleeting. Part of me doesn't want to hang around long enough for them to express some sort of criticism of it, like, oh, this is stupid, this is shit. I enjoy the fact that I've seen someone play my games, and I avert my eyes pretty quickly and just take it at that. But yeah, when I've seen that the little purchase icon flashes up, and I've seen that they've bought the game and that they're true supporters of the game, yeah, I'm happy to have met them indirectly, even if they haven't met me publicly directly.
And I imagine that family, parents and siblings and your wife, they must be astounded and proud at quite what's happened over the past few years.
Yes, I mean, well, part of me has kept it secret as much as you can do. I don't. I keep a low profile, and you have to bear in mind that very few people were supportive of anything I've done. I mean, I hate to say it, but my mother wanted me to get a real job, and she would stand at the door wistfully, as though I was a heroin addict, looking at me, obsessed with games and computers. Nothing will come of it. Just the. I don't mean to sound disparaging of her, because she has been very supportive in later life, but she was one of those parents that hated games, hated the fact that her son was obsessed with games, and she's had to accept that it did kind of pay off for all of us. But and yes, but yeah, I do feel that everything I've accomplished, I did so against the odds, against everybody's expectations. Because even my closest friends and my closest family, they did not envisage this for me. I had to envisage it for myself and work towards it.
But did you envisage it when you
Yeah,
first coded that first game? You thought you would be 50 million downloads, well known, massive popularity of all your games.
yeah. I lost the faith in 2008, but I did start with this strange, unfounded conviction that this would one day happen. Yeah, I do vividly remember. Uh, yeah, I vividly remember. It's crass to say, but I wrote. I wrote down like an affirmation. Bruce Lee used to do this thing where he would write down what he will be in 10 years time. I will be the highest paid movie star in Hong Kong, and he did it. And I heard that story, and I did the same thing when I was an 18-year-old boy with nothing in particular. Before any of this had happened, I said, I make games for a living. I run my own wrestling company, and I'm rich and all that, and I travel the world. And they all came true indirectly, because I do run my own wrestling company, in the sense that I created a game about running a wrestling company, and I created my own fake brands of wrestling. And I like the way that desire for something to happen did kind of come to fruition.
That's incredible. Then just the making that happen as a reality, because I guess a lot of people maybe would have that dream, but they would never get to the point that they could actually achieve it.
That was the frustrating thing in 2008, because I was possessed by this belief that this belonged to me, that I deserved to succeed to this level. I was convinced, and it was like a punishment for being arrogant. Life just said no, 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 not this year, no, 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 no. And after 10 years of testing my faith, I feel it's just suddenly, oh, all right then, go make a mobile app and it'll all happen. And I feel like just Noah. I was built. Someone told me to build an ark, and I'm like, okay, I'll just keep building this ark for 10 years. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. Everyone thinks I'm stupid, but I'll keep building this ark. Something's gonna happen. And then here's the flood of mobile gaming. Look, everybody's got mobiles. Millions of people all over the world. It's the flood. Oh, right. I've got an ark. I'll use that ark and I'll ride the waves of the flood. And it turns out okay again. So it's kind of, I look at it like that, where it was just decades of preparation, testing whether I really wanted it, what was I willing to do for this, how hard was I willing to work for it, and then you can have what you thought was your birthright.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, that seems as good a place to end it as any for now. But that's been absolutely fascinating, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure I'll probably go away and listen back and type up my notes and have other questions for you. So I know that you're incredibly busy, but as discussed, maybe if we could get another time, even if it's just half an hour at some point in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that would be a good idea to take away what you've heard here, and then next week we can unpack the specific things that you're interested in. Yeah,
exactly. Because I mean, it's always helpful when someone is as eloquent a guide as you are through.
Oh, I don't know about that. This is one of my biggest weaknesses, is that when I'm alone all day, you have to bear in mind I never speak to another human being, for most of the working day. So to speak for an hour is quite a rare opportunity for me. Part of me enjoys it, and part of me is not quite capable of it. So it's another challenge. I love challenges where I just sit myself in front of something that makes me uncomfortable, and I learn, I develop. I suppose
absolutely.
my passion is learning.
Yeah, well, you've been very, very capable here. So thank you so much for taking the time.